welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 1st of March, where I wanted to put some closure on the short story unit. We've been falling a little bit behind with short stories, and I also wanted to talk a bit about some upcoming assignments about short stories, and then get us ready to transition into the drama section. In terms of our upcoming writing assignments, there is a journal that is due, and I'm giving a bit of an extension. It would have been due today, but we didn't finish our short story unit, so I want to have that due on Thursday. That would be the 3rd, on Thursday at 11:59 p.m. to my email, ruiz@gcc.mass.edu, via PDF, because that's how my grading program works best. Basically, what I'm asking is that you write approximately a page or so for 3 separate short stories that you choose from the short story unit. So basically, you would be writing a page for each of those 3 short stories, or 3 pages total. The stories don't need to be related to one another. I was just interested in your thoughts and your observations about the 3 short stories that you select. Certainly, you can use anything that was discussed in class video or in class discussion form, as well as any other ideas or thoughts that occurred to you while you were reading those particular texts. More than just plot, not just what happened, but why those things happened, and also a place for you to ask questions. And I think of it as a conversation on paper, where basically I respond in turn as if we were having a conversation, and I evaluate it very informally on a checkmark system, with a plus being excellent and a check plus being very good and a check being satisfactory, though there's also less than satisfactory and unsatisfactory. And what I'll do is I'll get that back. I'm not, again, evaluating it in a formal way, so I'm not reading for grammar or mechanics, just for content. And hopefully that might guide you a little bit with the more formal writing assignment that will be due after spring break. And that will be our first paper, paper number 1, where I am asking you to select one of the short stories and to evaluate that short story in terms of finding a particular thesis or a position which you are going to support with evidence from the text. So as compared to the journals, which are much more open-ended, the paper would be much more focused. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the paper today as well. But first, I wanted to finish up the short story unit, and you'll see in the notes below that our short story girl, there is a YouTube video that I am asking that you watch, and it's a video of the author herself reading her short story, because the story is incredibly short. In many ways, it reads like a poem. So I'm going to stop here so that you can watch this, and then you can return at this point. This is about minute 3:07. Welcome back, everybody. This is our continuation of discussing the short story girl. As you heard the author read her particular piece, I've always wondered if she read that piece too slowly, as arrogant as that sounds, because of the use of the semicolon, which I hope you noticed when you were reading the text yourself, that it's really one long sentence, all joined by semicolons. And a semicolon is a piece of punctuation that we use between 2 complete sentences that are closely related to one another, and the writer wants to show that very close relationship. And it's something that you use sparingly, perhaps once or twice in a piece of writing, not certainly based on what we've seen in Girl, every sentence connection. And usually what we do is we put a period to stop each of the sentences, but instead of stopping those sentences, what the author has done is connected them all into one large sentence. Because I think that works very nicely thematically, in that the rules and the expectations for this girl are never ending. So even the punctuation emphasizes that, because there's never a stop. So I've always suggested that I'm not sure anybody can read this piece out loud correctly, because you should be able to read it all in one breath without a stop. And it's very similar to many of the pieces that we've discussed previously, but note that this piece is from an author from Antigua. So we've got cultural difference here, but despite the fact that there's cultural difference, which we can tell from certain references within the text, for instance, singing Bena. But there are timeless and universal concerns, which we've talked about also as being important in terms of identifying a piece of literature that's worth study. And this idea of the overwhelming nature of the task and responsibility for female is something that we saw in, let's say, A Story of an Hour, and also on some level in, or also in A Sorrowful Woman. And when we think about this mother figure and girl who seems to be basically giving these orders to the girl, the mother figure seems to be very much this domineering and controlling individual. A list of rules for a female in Antigua in the 1970s. And of course, that line that's repeated over and over again, the slut I know you're so bent on becoming, emphasizing the idea of the importance of sexual purity, or at least the appearance of sexual purity for female. Now, the girl speaks twice. At one point, she says she doesn't sing Bena, which is calypso music, in Sunday, in church or in Sunday school, and the mother ignores that. And then at the very ending, the girl asks, well, what if the baker won't let me feel the bread? And then the mother does respond to that. Or do you mean to say you're going to be the kind of girl who the baker won't let near the bread? And I think that's really the crux of this particular piece, because despite the domineering and controlling nature of the mother, there is a certain level of subversiveness in this text as well. And instruction on not just how to follow expectation, but how to rebel. For instance, how to spit in the air, or more importantly, how to make a medicine to throw away a child before it becomes a child, which I think is directly related to the phrase, the slut I know you're so bent on becoming. Despite the emphasis on sexual purity, the girl, which we assume is a daughter, or at least a daughter figure, is given information about how to preserve her reputation if, in the effect, she becomes pregnant. So I think that this piece, much like many of the other pieces that we've read over the course of the semester, has a certain level of complexity to it, despite its short length. And certainly, if nothing else, I wanted you to read this piece so that I could talk a bit about the semicolon and how these more contemporary works oftentimes will do things that are very unexpected and break rules of grammar and mechanics. And since girl is about rules and perhaps ways to break rules, it seems that the use of the semicolon also works very nicely in that respect. And then I ended with Popular Mechanics, and this is by Raymond Carver. And this is known as Minimalist Fiction. And the idea is that less is more. And what we have is a very, very brief episode here that's mostly taken up by dialogue. The title itself is quite interesting, Popular Mechanics. And if you were reading the questions at the ending of the stories, you would have noted that originally the story was entitled Mine, which makes a certain level of sense, because what we've got are two parents, or at least two parent figures, who are arguing over the possession of their child. And the ending result is rather bleak, but we're never specifically told what happens. It reminds me very much of Rose for Emily, where it is not detailed. The story allows our imagination to fill in the blanks of what exactly was happening with Miss Emily and the corpse of Homer with that strand of iron gray hair, which is our clue that she's been lying next to the corpse years after Homer has been murdered. And very similarly, in something like Popular Mechanics, we're told that both parents pull on that child as hard as they can. And in this manner, the issue was decided. And even though we might want that one parent were to get the child, the reality is that if you've got two adults pulling as hard as they can on a baby, they're going to rip that child in two, which is a great metaphor for what happens emotionally to children when they're torn in two during divorce. If you are familiar with the Bible, you might be familiar with the story of Solomon, because the story is based on the story of Solomon. The biblical story of Solomon is about two women who go to King Solomon, both claiming motherhood of a child. And Solomon asks them to basically settle the disputes among themselves, and they're unable to do so. So Solomon says that the only fair thing that he can do is to split that child, that baby, in two, so that each woman can have half. And the true biological mother steps forward and says, no, let the other woman have it. And then Solomon responds, well, you must be the real mother, not the other woman, because only a real mother would put her child's welfare and well-being above her own. And what we get in Popular Mechanics is a story when neither parent is willing to put the child's welfare or well-being above their own. And the idea of mine, because they both want possession of the child, much like earlier in the story, they're both fighting for possession of things like the baby's picture, which is a little bit of foreshadowing, because the picture is basically an inanimate object that would in fact be ruined if it were torn in two. And of course, that's what happens with the child. Later on, when they're arguing over the child, they knock over a flower pot. Again, some more foreshadowing that there's going to be death. And of course, a flower has a certain level of life to it. And the idea that this is popular for our title, Popular Mechanics. Again, thinking about the time period, 1981, when divorce was becoming much more common. Of course, today it's the rule rather than the exception. But back in the 1980s was a time of transition, and this idea that this is something that many couples have experienced in terms of custody battles. Hopefully not to the point where they're literally tearing their child in two, but certainly they're doing so emotionally. Mechanics, if you think about mechanics, oftentimes is a way to talk about how things work. And of course, this story talks about how things can be destroyed. Popular Mechanics is also the name of a magazine. It's a magazine that talks about how to build things, and this piece talks about how to destroy things. In terms of thinking about it being experimental in terms of some of the construction of its writing, you might have noticed that no quotation marks are used around the pieces of dialogue, even though this is mostly dialogue. And I think that's quite important, because quotation marks usually it gives us a sense of attribution of who is speaking a particular piece. And the idea of having no quote marks is that this language is just so universal that we don't need to give it a credit to a particular person, that this is the kind of dialogue that occurs whenever couples are splitting apart. And of course, this entire piece is about splitting. The setting initially is very dark, which helps to set the tone. Again, very minimalistic. But in this particular piece, we're introduced to a window that's not positive, not in the way it was in Story of an Hour with Mrs. Mallard, but it's more negative, because we're told it's a little window, it's shoulder high, it's facing the back, and there's streaks of dirty water that are running across it. Again, so all of this is establishing the mood that the snow is melting into dirty water, and the snow could be seen as something as positive or pure, pristine. But of course, as we know so well in New England and mud season, it can also be something that's quite dirty. And while it was getting dark on the outside, it was also getting dark on the inside. That's literal and also figurative about the darkness that will be overcoming this particular family as they are arguing. Ironically, in the kitchen is usually seen as a place of safety. But of course, when you are holding a child over a stove, it's anything but safe. So those were just a few of the things that I wanted you to consider about Girl and Popular Mechanics. And I thought that could be today's attendance question, would be to examine not the stories, but the authors. So I'm going to ask you to look up biographical information either about Jamaica Kincaid, who wrote Girl, or Raymond Carver, who wrote Popular Mechanics, and briefly indicate in the discussion forum how that information could be used to understand the author's writing. Now, there are lots of different ways you could go about finding information. Certainly, I know most people's go-to is to go straight to Google or perhaps Wikipedia and find the first piece of information that is available. I'm not necessarily averse to that, but there are certainly better ways to find information. And this is my plug for the GCC library, specifically for the databases that exist in the GCC library. These are electronic resources, so you do have to access them on the internet, but they aren't available to everyone. They're only available through subscription, and GCC has a subscription, your tuition dollars at work. So that means that you have access to sources that the general public does not have. And the reason why these sources are considered preferable is because they've gone through a vetting process. Or in other words, there are staffs of individuals who evaluate the information to verify its validity. That's not to say that mistakes can't be made, but it certainly has a higher probability of accuracy and validity than something you would find on the wide open web. And in fact, if you were to go onto the GCC website and look at some of the databases, you'll see that there are databases that are specifically devoted to literature, as well as databases that are specifically devoted to author biography. So those two might be of interest to you. But again, I'm not necessarily averse to you going on the open internet. You just want to make sure that the information that you're citing has a certain level of accuracy to it. So if you could briefly indicate, you choose one of the two authors, either Jamaica Kincaid or Raymond Carver, find out a little bit of information about their life and how that information might help you understand their particular text a bit better, then what I will do is respond to that. And in the interim, what I wanted to do was to transition away from short story, indicate that our next unit is going to be on drama. So we will be spending the next several weeks talking about what is drama, how do you read it, and ultimately how do you write about it. And we will have 3 major dramas in our drama section. We will begin with Oedipus the King, and you can see in the notes below that I've included a link for that particular site or for that particular play, assuming that you don't have access to the textbook. And we will watch performance as well as talk about the actual drama itself. So you'll notice that we've got several weeks devoted to each of the dramas. The idea is that dramas are longer, so they will require more time. And we also are going to have to set aside some time for performance. That said, what would be ideal is that you've got the drama read in its entirety at the beginning of the section that drama is indicated. And then as we are talking about that drama over the next several classes, you're working on the next drama, which for us would be Shakespeare and A Midsummer Night's Dream. And then we would end with A Raisin in the Sun by Lorraine Hansberry. But I understand that oftentimes what is ideal is not necessarily possible. So try to read as much as you can. And we'll talk a little bit next class about some of the reasons why Oedipus the King is a rather unique drama and why it is that we would be reading it, even though it is so removed from us culturally and from our particular time period. But that's what's coming up in terms of drama. Where we are is talking a little bit about papers as well as journal writing assignments. So in our syllabus and other documents folder, you will notice that I have uploaded 2 handouts. One is about paper topics, about ideas that you could pursue for your first paper. That said, you're free to create your own paper topic. I just ask that you touch base with me if you are going to do something like that. Paper number 1, and now I'm reading from the handout that's in the syllabus and other documents folder, will be a critical paper. In other words, you shouldn't be consulting outside resources. That said, if you really wanted to consult outside resources, come talk with me and we can negotiate. But actually writing a research paper is a more difficult exercise than writing a critical paper, because when you're writing a research paper, you have to not only summarize what others have said about the text, but you still have to come up with your original ideas. So what I'm interested in is making sure that you're able to read the text on your own, so that outside of this class, if you are confronted with a piece of literature, you can begin to make sense of it, even though you haven't necessarily read it previously or been involved in a class that's discussed it. So the paper length, approximately 4 to 5 pages long, but as long or as short as it needs to be for you to be able to support your particular thesis, your position that reasonable people could disagree about. and that would be 4 to 5 pages, double space, 1-inch margins. That's included also, that information, in our syllabus, and I'm hopeful that this is a review for what you would have talked about in English 101, but I'm still briefly going over it just in case it might not necessarily be the clearest thing in your mind at this particular point. And you should number your pages, and you should also have a cover page, which is just a separate sheet of paper. In this instance, it would just be a separate screen that lists your name, my name, the due date, the class, the paper number, and also, of course, the paper title. And usually the paper title goes in the middle of the page, and usually all of the other information goes on the bottom right-hand corner. But you've got some flexibility there. And I've identified on that paper topics handout some topics that you might want to pursue for your paper, but these are merely suggestions. So you can write on your own topic, and of course you can always combine multiple ideas. These are just ideas that occur to me, and I try to identify a topic for each of the texts that we've read in the short story unit, but note that these topics are so broad that they are applicable to a number of the short stories. So number 1, discuss the theme of isolation and God Wins a Sorrowful Woman. And not just talking about how she literally isolates herself, physically isolates herself from her family, but how she's misunderstood, and how society also tends to isolate female and reduce them to role of wife and mother, at least according to this author in this time period. Discuss the use of symbolism in Chopin's The Story of an Hour. And of course, symbolism is something that we could probably find in all of the short stories, but especially The Story of an Hour, because it is so short. And we talked a little bit about all of the references to freedom and rebirth and renewal, and all of the symbols that the author used to illustrate the emotions that our main character was feeling. Discuss the theme of death in Faulkner's A Rose for Emily. And when we talked about Rose for Emily, obviously there are literal deaths. Emily dies, her father dies, Homer dies. But we also talked about Emily clinging to a dead past, a dead way of life. And the theme of love, while that's something that you could probably find in all of the pieces, I thought might be interesting to examine in A Rose for Emily and Van der Zee's A Secret Sorrow. You'll remember we talked about A Secret Sorrow at the beginning of the semester as our example of formula fiction, that it followed such specific criteria and rules that it really didn't have any kind of originality or depth to it. So if you were going to compare and contrast the two pieces, you probably are going to talk about how, while both examine love, A Secret Sorrow does so in a very formulaic, predictable way, as opposed to A Rose for Emily. Though we had talked about in some ways A Rose for Emily could be predictable if it was put in chronological order. It's one of the reasons why the author gives us mixed chronology. But that said, even if it were in chronological order, there's still so much there in terms of possibilities with symbolism and metaphor and social and political statements, and something that we would never find in Van der Zee's The Secret Sorrow. Or discuss the theme of ambiguity in Young Goodman Brown. We talked about how ultimately you can never know if the witch meeting occurred or not, because ultimately that's not the point of the piece. The point of the piece is that we see how Goodman is destroyed by his knowledge or his instruction in the idea of evil within humanity. And that is something that goes completely against the Puritan ethos. And that said, while Goodman is able to see the hypocrisy and evil in others, he cannot see the hypocrisy and evil within himself. And this sense of ambiguity in that individuals aren't necessarily pure good or pure evil goes completely against the Puritan idea of seeing things in terms of absolutes. So I think the ambiguity of the witch meeting reinforces the ambiguity that exists within humanity as well. Examine the role of conflict in Hemingway's A Soldier's Home. And obviously, since Krebs is a soldier, he was involved in a conflict, a military battle. But I would suggest that the conflicts don't end when he returns home. There are multiple conflicts that he faces with his society, his family, and even with himself. And the theme of battle, which is somewhat similar to the theme of conflict in Battle Royal, obviously there is a literal battle, there's a physical boxing match, but that's used to illustrate the idea of the multiple battles that Black individuals need to fight in society, a society who sees them as invisible because a society reduces them merely to the color of their skin and refuses to see their individuality. Or compare and contrast Girl and Popular Mechanics. The two pieces I talked about today both seem appropriate for comparing and contrasting because they were written around the same time period and they're both very, very short. That said, they also have differences between them. So I've always thought that the compare and contrast paper is an interesting exercise, showing similarities and differences and talking about why those things are important. But again, you could compare and contrast just about any of the texts that we've discussed in our short story unit. And you'll see that at the bottom, I have an asterisk that says a good question to ask yourself when you're writing a paper or reading someone else's writing is, have I or has the author said this as clearly, concisely, believably, or gracefully as possible? And you can see immediately after that in the parentheses, I've got the author's last name and the page number. I close my parentheses and then I end my punctuation. This is called the MLA system of parenthetical documentation, or the Modern Language Association system of parenthetical documentation, that you use parentheses after a quote, and in those parentheses you indicate the least amount of information a reader would need in order to be able to identify where that quote could be found. And usually that's a page number, but it could also mean that you have to add an author's surname in addition to the page number if it's not clear which author you are referencing. You might need to add part of the title as well as the author's surname and a page number if you've got multiple texts by the author. And there are different ways to go about citing electronic sources. And that said, different electronic sources are constructed in different ways. So there isn't necessarily one particular way to approach that. The best thing to do is to look up the MLA system, and you can do that through the GCC library, also through Purdue OWL, which you can see that I've noted in the notes below. Both of them are great resources for finding information. But if you can't find how to cite something, you can always ask me. Or you can always remember the idea behind citation, which is basically to make a good faith effort to let the reader know where the information is coming from. So as long as you're doing that, you should be just fine. Now, all of this works in a way so that there is a works cited page, a page at the very ending of your writing that indicates all of the works that you have cited or quoted in your paper. And this is very useful, for instance, in a research paper because you are using sources that the reader is not aware of. For this particular exercise, though, you are writing a critical paper. So you are just referencing the source that I assigned for class. So in this instance, you don't even necessarily have to submit in a works cited page. I would be satisfied with you just doing parenthetical documentation. And even if you're using a different edition, I would just assume that your page numbers are accurate, even though they might be slightly different from my page numbers. Now, that said, if you are using outside sources, you must include a works cited page. And this is a page that lists all of the things that you quoted within your paper, giving all of the detailed information, not just author, but place of publication and publisher and so forth, so that a reader could find that particular edition of that particular text and verify the authenticity of that particular quote. But again, since I'm assuming that you did this in English 101, I'm satisfied with you just using parenthetical documentation for analyzing the particular text. And I wanted to just draw your attention a little bit to a handout that I had included in the syllabus and the other documents folder that is entitled The Critical Paper. And again, there are lots of ways that you can go about finding information about how to construct a paper. You remember that our textbook had reviewed some of that at the very beginning of the semester in the early set of readings that I had assigned about how to go through writing a paper. And also Purdue OWL goes through that. The GCC library has links about that. And I suspect that you've got handbooks and references from previous English classes as well. But this handout, the critical paper, was a handout that was actually distributed to me in my undergraduate days, and I saved it, and it's still one of the best that I found, so I want to share it with you, even though it is dated. And you can see that it's divided up into 3 sections: planning, writing, and then finally presentation. And I can tell you that most students skip the planning stage and they go straight to the writing, which is to their detriment, because what they end up doing is trying to write the perfect first sentence. And when they're unable to do so, they become frustrated and they stop. And then they return to the paper, usually at the last minute, and then they just write something hurriedly and they submitted it. So I encourage you to begin thinking about the planning stage now. And again, the idea behind the planning stage is not that you are committing to anything. And if you're going to write anything down, you don't have to worry about grammar or mechanics. These are for your eyes only, these ideas. And in the planning stage, do keep in mind, though, that you are analyzing. You are not summarizing. You're not telling us what happened, which is what I call the junior high school book report. You're telling us why those things happen. So assume the reader has some familiarity with the text and avoid the temptation to retell the story. Or in other words, confine your comments on plot to subordinate clauses. Those are the least important parts of the sentences, emphasizing the main clause or the major part of the sentence, the significance of that action. You need to have a strong and specific thesis that implies some sort of interpretive conclusion about the work, and that's stated someplace in the first paragraph. That said, you may not know what your thesis is until you're actually done writing, because the process of writing is a process of discovery. But there's nothing that says that you have to write in chronological order. I oftentimes suggest students write their paper and then reread it to themselves and try to summarize in 1 or 2 sentences what they've said. And then they can plug that into their introduction after the fact. That's their thesis. And you want to have a thesis that is comprehensive enough to be important. You don't want it to be too general or bland. So for instance, saying something like, in Hamlet, Shakespeare explores the complexities of experience, really says nothing at all, because basically every author in every text examines the complexities of experience. Or saying something like, Shakespeare employs much imagery in Hamlet. My response is, well, yeah, so what? Most authors use imagery. The question is, what imagery is employed and why? So, each topic sentence that you are writing of your body paragraphs, because your body paragraphs are where you give evidence and details, those topic sentences, or the first sentences, if your paragraphs are well written, should serve as a summary of that paragraph. So basically, you should be able to read the first sentences of all of the paragraphs and get a kind of summary of what your paper is about. Keep in mind that a paragraph is supposed to talk about one topic or one idea, and a paragraph needs to be minimum 3 sentences, because it needs to have minimum a beginning, a middle, and an end if you're writing for an academic situation or a business situation. I know there are different rules for journalism, for instance. So no 1 or 2 sentence paragraphs, even in the concluding paragraph. And I know the concluding paragraph is perhaps one of the more difficult paragraphs to write, because you're not supposed to add new information, but you're supposed to give closure to your arguments. And by this point, you're tired and you're frustrated, and you've probably said everything you need to say. So think of it as a kind of marathon where you're saving a little bit of energy for the end in your conclusion, where you could perhaps hint at a related work. Or if you run into trouble, what almost always works is that you can relate the text to contemporary times. And again, your conclusion, just like every other paragraph, has to be minimum 3 sentences, preferably longer. Keep in mind what my job is basically to take the opposite viewpoint of whatever it is that you argue. So if you want to argue that Mrs. Mallard feels free in the story of an hour, my argument is going to be, no, she doesn't. So you need to prove that, even though, of course, I know that she feels free. We've talked about it in class. You can either do that through paraphrase, putting things in your own words, or through quotation, writing down exactly what was said in the text word for word. And one of the things you could do is quote when she says under her breath, free, 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 to illustrate that she feels, well, free. And this is where you would document by giving in parentheses at the ending of that quote the page number for where that appeared. Think of yourself as a kind of attorney where basically you're taking the pieces of evidence that support your particular client's position and you are presenting that. And a good attorney can argue either side of the case. It's the same piece of the same pieces of evidence, but they're picking and choosing which are going to be most beneficial for their particular position. So again, what should happen is that you could argue multiple things in different papers, and in fact they can even contradict each other, yet all of them could be valid if you've got evidence within the text to support what it is you're saying. But that's the key. You need to have evidence so that your position is at least possible. So also in the introduction, you should include the name of the text and the name of the author. So it's very clear to the reader what it is you are going to be talking about and what your thesis is. Now, the second piece is the writing piece, and I can't emphasize this enough, that the first principle of good writing is economy, the second is simplicity. Say as much as possible in as few words as possible. So what you want to be able to do is to be able to go through your sentences individually and ask yourself, can I say this in fewer words without sacrificing meaning? And if so, you probably want to do that. And I know this can be painful because now all of a sudden you're losing length in your paper. But the idea is that length comes from argument, not necessarily from unnecessary language. So this takes time. So the idea is that you've done the planning and the drafting stage early so that you can go by and really pay attention to the construction of your sentences. Good writing depends on strong verbs and nouns, adjectives and adverbs, descriptive words. They can be useful, but you don't want to overuse them. In other words, you don't want to pad the paper with them purely because you are trying to get length for your paper. Rather, it's better to have a shorter paper that's well written than a longer paper that's not. Vary your sentences. So you should have some short and some long. Too many long sentences sounds dense. Too many short sentences sounds choppy. And certainly you want to vary your sentence openings so that you don't want multiple sentences in a row beginning in the same way. For instance, you don't want 3 sentences in a row beginning with Young Goodman Brown. So you want to mix things up. Random notes, cliches. These are expressions that are so overused that they no longer have any kind of originality. Or things like proverbs, which are expressions, or slang, informal language that's created so that other groups can't understand it. In other words, it's what adolescents do every generation. They create their own language so the adults can't understand. All of these things are things you want to avoid because there is a greater possibility for misunderstanding if you are using cliches or proverbs or slang. So take something like it's raining cats and dogs outside. What do cats and dogs have to do with rain? Imagine if you were a second or a third language learner of English, the difficulty of trying to understand that phrase and why it is that not only we use that phrase, but we put cats before dogs. Or you can, of course, think about slang. When we say that somebody is a cool person, we usually mean that that's somebody who's interesting or engaging. However, cool literally is related to temperature. The same with hot. When we say somebody is hot, we usually mean that they're physically attractive, but hot is also related to temperature. Imagine the difficulty of understanding that if English was not your first language. And I always tell a story at this point. It's a disturbing story, so this is your forewarning. But it is a true story, and it occurred several decades ago, and it was all about language and misunderstandings of language, where a second language student was going to a party, and he ended up going to the wrong home, a home that had been burglarized several times previously, so the owner was rather anxious. And the student knocked on the door, and the owner answered the door, and the student asked, "Is this where the party is happening?" And the owner responded with a piece of slang that I suspect you probably know. He said, "Freeze," which means to stop or halt. But the student continued walking forward, whether he misunderstood or misheard, I'm not quite sure. But the owner pulled out the gun that he always carried and shot that gun off and basically killed that student on his doorstep. And I always use that as an example about why it is that English teachers are so adamant about avoiding slang and cliches and trite expressions and so forth, because there's just a greater chance of misunderstanding. So we want to have some standardization. So now the last section is the proofreading section. And ideally, you finished reading or you finished writing your paper early enough that you could set it aside for a few days, at the very least a few hours, and then go back to it with a fresh eye, in order for you to be able to find mistakes. If you have difficulty proofreading, I suggest that you read backwards, starting from the last page, going to the front. Obviously, the text won't make sense because, again, you want to focus on the sentences themselves. You should have a title for your paper, and it should be original. So you don't want to call your paper, for instance, A Rose for Emily, because that title's already been taken. William Faulkner called his piece that. However, you could call your paper Death in A Rose for Emily, because William Faulkner never wrote that particular title. Note that we use certain punctuation marks to indicate if a text is a short story or a poem or a novel or a drama, something that has been published. If it's something shorter that can appear in a larger work, such as a short story, we put the title in quotation marks. Hence, the title The Rose for Emily would be in quote marks. If it's something longer, like a drama, let's say Midsummer Night's Dream, which eventually we'll get to, then that would be underlined. But you don't have to underline or put in quotation marks your own title, nor do you have to bold it or italicize it either, because your title is not something that has been published, or your writing is not something that has been published. And to give you an idea of how old this handout is, as I'm reading along, instructors prefer typewritten papers. Obviously, your paper needs to be typed, double space, 1-inch margins with a cover page. And if you are handing in a physical paper, you wouldn't submit a bulky folder or a plastic cover, and you would use a staple. Obviously, that's not going to be the case with an electronic submission. Papers are due on the day to sign at the beginning of class, so if you need an extension, just ask for it. I'll be happy to grant it for you, or grant it to you, and that's the same with the journals. And the first paper, I view it as a kind of draft, in the sense that everyone has the option of rewriting the first paper after I've put my comments and my feedback on it. And I'm reading not just for content, the way I would for a journal, but also for grammar and mechanics. And if that feedback isn't enough, I'd be happy to meet with you. And you can incorporate that feedback into a revision, and then you get the higher of the 2 grades. I just ask that you submit in the original copy with my comments along with the revision. And you've got up until the ending of the semester to do that, but the sooner the better for everybody involved. And again, you'll notice that on our course outline, your first paper was due after spring break. So I'm hopeful that even though we've been falling behind a little bit, after spring break, we'll be caught up with our syllabus so that we can be on our targeted dates. Again, we are moving forward to drama. So we are talking about Oedipus the King, and then Midsummer Night's Dream, and then finally A Raisin in the Sun. So what I wanted to do next class was to talk a little bit more about quotation, give you some examples of quotes, and then talk a little bit about the origins of drama and how to go about reading drama and writing about drama. So I look forward to see which author you're going to choose to respond to for your class attendance question, and I will, of course, respond in turn. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.